The mathematical force that created the modern world has been quietly murdered. In 1790, Benjamin Franklin left 1,000 pounds sterling to the cities of Boston and Philadelphia with specific instructions. The money was to be invested at compound interest for 200 years. Franklin calculated that mathematical compounding would transform his modest bequest into approximately 131,000 pounds by 1990. His experiment was designed to demonstrate the civilizational power of compound interest, the mathematical miracle that had built Western prosperity over 4 centuries. Franklin's calculation was perfect for his era. At the prevailing interest rates of his time, money doubled approximately every 14 years through compound growth. Over 2 centuries, his initial investment would compound through 14 doubling cycles, creating wealth that seemed almost magical to those unfamiliar with exponential mathematics. The experiment succeeded brilliantly, generating millions of dollars for educational and public purposes exactly as Franklin had predicted. But if Franklin attempted the same experiment today, it would fail completely. Not because compound interest has stopped working mathematically, but because the interest rates necessary for compound growth have been systematically destroyed by monetary authorities, who either don't understand or don't care about the civilizational consequences of their actions. The mathematical foundation of Western wealth creation has been murdered through policies that make genuine compound interest impossible for ordinary citizens. Today, savings accounts earn 0.5% annually, while real inflation runs between 8% and 12%. That represents a negative real return of approximately 8% to 11% annually. Instead of money doubling every 14 years through compound growth, money now loses half its purchasing power every 6 to 9 years through compound erosion. The mathematical relationship has been reversed from wealth creation to wealth destruction. This isn't temporary monetary policy adjustment. This is the systematic elimination of the mathematical foundation that created middle-class prosperity across 4 centuries of Western civilization. Compound interest built the modern world by allowing ordinary people to transform modest savings into substantial wealth through time and mathematical progression. Its destruction represents civilizational regression to pre-industrial economic relationships. The mathematics of compound interest operate according to laws as reliable as physics. When money earns positive real returns consistently over time, small amounts grow into large amounts through exponential progression. Albert Einstein allegedly called compound interest the 8th wonder of the world, noting that those who understand it earn it, while those who don't pay it. But Einstein's observation assumed that positive real interest rates would remain available to savers. Compound interest requires 3 mathematical conditions: principal amount, positive interest rate exceeding inflation, and time for exponential growth to operate. Remove any of these conditions, and compound interest becomes impossible. Current monetary policy has eliminated the second condition, positive real interest rates, making compound interest mathematically unavailable regardless of principal amounts or time horizons. Historical analysis reveals that compound interest availability correlates directly with civilizational advancement and social stability. Periods when ordinary citizens could earn positive real returns on savings coincide with technological innovation, infrastructure development, and social mobility. Periods when compound interest becomes unavailable coincide with economic stagnation, social stratification, and political instability. Medieval Europe provides clear demonstration of this relationship. During periods when usury laws prevented compound interest, economic development stagnated for centuries. Innovation was limited, social mobility was restricted, and wealth concentrated among hereditary landowners who controlled physical assets rather than financial instruments. The Renaissance began when Italian city-states allowed compound interest, creating mathematical incentives for savings that funded exploration, invention, and artistic achievement. The Protestant work ethic that Max Weber identified as foundational to capitalist development was really compound interest ethic disguised as religious doctrine. Protestant emphasis on thrift, savings, and delayed gratification made mathematical sense when savings earned positive real returns through compound growth. The moral framework justified sacrificing immediate consumption for future wealth that compound interest made mathematically certain. But compound interest ethic becomes irrational when real returns are negative. Thrift becomes financially destructive when savings lose purchasing power faster than they accumulate nominal value. The moral framework collapses when mathematical reality makes savings a losing proposition rather than a path to prosperity. Current negative real interest rates represent the first systematic elimination of compound interest availability in Western economic history since medieval usury restrictions. Previous monetary disruptions, wars, depressions, currency crises, created temporary interruptions to compound interest availability. Current policies create permanent interruption that fundamentally alters the mathematical relationship between work, savings, and wealth creation. The Federal Reserve's sustained zero interest rate policy, combined with quantitative easing programs that deliberately inflate asset prices while suppressing savings returns, represents conscious policy choice to eliminate compound interest for ordinary citizens. Fed officials understand the mathematical consequences of their actions, but prioritize short-term economic stability over long-term wealth creation opportunities for middle-class savers. European central bank negative interest rate policies make compound interest destruction even more explicit. When banks charge depositors for holding their money, the mathematical possibility of compound growth through savings disappears entirely. Negative rates represent mathematical confession that monetary authorities prefer wealth destruction to wealth creation for ordinary citizens. Bank of Japan's multi-decade zero interest rate policy demonstrates the civilizational consequences of compound interest elimination. Japanese savings rates have declined from among the world's highest to below replacement levels as mathematical incentives for savings disappeared. Japanese economic growth has stagnated for 30 years as compound interest unavailability removed mathematical foundations for capital accumulation and productive investment. The destruction of compound interest creates generational wealth transfer from young savers to elderly asset holders. Young people cannot build wealth through savings and compound growth as previous generations did. They must either remain poor or assume debt to purchase assets that increase in price through monetary inflation rather than productive value creation. Older generations who accumulated assets when compound interest was available benefit from asset price inflation that monetary policy creates to compensate for eliminated savings returns. Their wealth grows through monetary manipulation rather than compound interest, but the mathematical effect benefits them at the expense of younger generations who cannot access the same wealth-building mechanisms. This generational transfer represents the largest wealth redistribution in modern economic history, but it occurs through mathematical manipulation rather than explicit policy, making it largely invisible to political analysis. The redistribution appears as natural market forces rather than systematic wealth confiscation from savers to asset holders. Real estate provides the clearest example of compound interest destruction consequences. Previous generations could buy homes with savings accumulated through compound interest over reasonable time periods. Current generations cannot accumulate down payments through savings because compound interest doesn't exist, forcing them into debt-based purchases that transfer wealth to lenders rather than building equity through compound growth. Stock markets have replaced compound interest as a wealth-building mechanism for those with sufficient capital to participate, but stock ownership requires existing wealth that compound interest historically provided to ordinary citizens. Without compound interest availability, stock market participation becomes privilege of inherited wealth rather than result of savings discipline. The mathematical destruction of compound interest eliminates social mobility mechanisms that created middle-class prosperity. When savings cannot grow through compound interest, ordinary people cannot transform labor income into investment capital. Wealth remains concentrated among those who already own assets rather than flowing to those willing to work, save, and invest over time. Cryptocurrency represents an attempt to recreate compound interest through technological innovation. But crypto returns depend on speculative appreciation rather than compound growth from productive economic activity. The mathematical stability that made traditional compound interest civilizationally beneficial cannot be replicated through speculative instruments that create wealth for some by destroying wealth for others. Gold and precious metals provide compound interest substitute through inflation protection, but precious metals don't generate the productive compound returns that built Western civilization. Metal ownership preserves existing wealth, but doesn't create the exponential growth that allowed ordinary citizens to build substantial wealth from modest savings. The psychological consequences of compound interest destruction extend beyond individual financial planning to social cohesion and political stability. When mathematical pathways to prosperity disappear, social frustration increases and political extremism becomes attractive. Citizens who cannot improve their economic position through savings and compound growth become receptive to political promises that involve wealth redistribution rather than wealth creation. Historical periods when compound interest was unavailable, medieval Europe, post-war hyperinflations, socialist economies, experienced political instability and social stratification that persisted until compound interest availability was restored. Current elimination of compound interest through monetary policy creates similar conditions for social and political disruption. The destruction of compound interest also eliminates long-term thinking incentives that compound growth historically created. When savings produce negative real returns, mathematical incentives favor immediate consumption over delayed gratification. The time preference that encouraged long-term planning, infrastructure investment, and intergenerational wealth transfer disappears when compound interest becomes unavailable. Modern monetary theory attempts to justify compound interest destruction through arguments that government spending can replace private savings as economic growth mechanism. MMT theorists argue that low interest rates encourage debt-financed consumption that generates more economic activity than compound interest accumulation. But this argument ignores mathematical reality that debt-financed consumption creates future obligations while compound interest creates future assets. The civilizational difference between debt-based and savings-based economic growth becomes clear through historical comparison. Societies that built wealth through compound interest, Victorian Britain, post-war America, modern Switzerland, created sustainable prosperity that persisted across generations. Societies that relied on debt-financed consumption, late Roman Empire, pre-revolutionary France, modern Greece, experienced boom-bust cycles that destroyed accumulated wealth. Central bank policies that eliminate compound interest while encouraging debt accumulation represent conscious choice to transform Western economies from savings-based wealth creation to debt-based consumption. The mathematical consequences are predictable and historically documented, but policymakers pursue these approaches despite evidence of their civilizational destructiveness. The death of compound interest explains many economic phenomena that conventional analysis treats as unrelated problems. Rising wealth inequality, declining social mobility, political polarization, and generational conflict all stem from mathematical elimination of the primary mechanism through which ordinary citizens historically built wealth over time. Understanding compound interest death as systematic policy choice rather than natural economic development provides insight into why traditional economic solutions fail to address current problems. Political proposals for wealth redistribution, minimum wage increases, or enhanced social programs cannot replace the mathematical wealth creation that compound interest provided when it was available to ordinary citizens. The restoration of compound interest requires fundamental monetary policy changes that current political and economic institutions resist because asset holders who benefit from current policies have more political influence than savers who suffer from compound interest destruction. The mathematical solution is clear, but the political obstacles to implementation appear insurmountable within existing institutional frameworks. International competition may eventually force compound interest restoration, as economies that provide positive real returns to savers attract capital and talent from economies that destroy savings through negative real rates. Singapore, Switzerland, and other jurisdictions that maintain positive real interest rates demonstrate competitive advantages that compound interest availability creates. But competitive pressure operates slowly, while the compound interest destruction creates immediate and permanent damage to individual wealth-building opportunities. Citizens who reach peak earning capacity during periods when compound interest is unavailable lose decades of potential wealth accumulation that can never be recovered, even if policies eventually change. The silent death of compound interest represents civilizational tragedy that affects millions of people who don't understand the mathematical forces destroying their wealth-building opportunities. The destruction occurs through technical monetary policies that appear separate from ordinary economic life, but systematically eliminate the mathematical foundation that created modern prosperity. Benjamin Franklin's compound interest experiment succeeded because his era understood that positive real returns on savings were essential for civilizational advancement. Modern monetary authorities have forgotten or rejected this wisdom, pursuing short-term policy goals that destroy long-term wealth creation opportunities for ordinary citizens. The mathematical force that built the modern world has been murdered through ignorance, short-sightedness, and policy choices that prioritize immediate economic manipulation over sustainable wealth creation. The death is silent because most people don't understand compound interest mathematics well enough to recognize what has been taken from them. But mathematics don't disappear because policymakers ignore them. Compound interest will eventually reassert itself through economic forces that current policies cannot control indefinitely. The question is whether civilizational damage from compound interest destruction can be reversed before alternative mathematical relationships, debt compounding, inflation compounding, political instability compounding, create consequences that make compound interest restoration impossible. The mathematical force that created the modern world has been quietly murdered. Its death threatens to destroy the civilizational foundation that 4 centuries of compound growth created. The restoration of compound interest represents civilizational necessity that transcends economic policy preferences. Without it, the mathematical basis for middle-class prosperity disappears forever.